Your Excellency Wamkele Mene, thank you very much for taking time out to talk to us. Now, we've heard so much about the AfCFTA, and it's a pleasure to have you here to actually explain things to us. Because prior to coming on air, I did mention that we've been following the progress of the AfCFTA since its commencement. When you speak to people in the community, they're still not sure about the AfCFTA. So if I may ask, if you could explain what the AfCFTA is and its purpose.
First, thank you for inviting me. The AfCFTA is about two things: integrating our market, industrializing our continent. We have a market of 1.3 billion people that is potentially globally competitive, just like India, just like China. However, we all know we have been fragmented for many, many decades. We have economies that are individually very, very small. We have lack of competitiveness, whether it comes to trade or investment, because we have been approaching competitiveness individually as each country. And of course, there's not a single country in Africa that can, on its own, without the others, that can be globally competitive. And so our heads of states decided that let us consolidate on this large number, on this large population, and create one single market, and also consolidate our combined GDP to make sure that we are competitive as a continent. So what we've been doing in the last 2 years is to create the rules for that consolidation to happen, the underlying rules for a consolidated market economy, very much like what the European Union did about 70 years ago. So we have started on that journey. Of course, we are late in the game. I think everybody knows that. It's 65 years later, almost 70 years later, that we are in this starting this journey. But I think that the political will is there, and certainly the commitment is there for those countries that have ratified the agreement.
And I know that the AfCFTA is part of the African Union Agenda 2063.
Yes.
So it's one of its main policies. And I think probably one of the most important ones. You've spoken about the trade aspect or the integration aspect. Some may argue we already have regional blocks. You have ECOWAS, you have SADC. Why the AfCFTA?
Well, the regional economic communities are focusing on intra-regional economic activity, so intra-regional trade or intra-regional investment. Today, if you are in ECOWAS, you want to trade with somebody in East Africa, you are, as a person from ECOWAS, you are as competitive as a person from the United States or the United Kingdom or China. You have no preference into the market of the East African community, and vice versa, and other regions as well. So what the AfCFTA is intended to do is to bring those regions together so that as a business person in the East African community, we have a preferential market access in West Africa and vice versa. So that you as an African will now receive better treatment in the region that you are trading in, not your own region, but the other region that you're trading in. You have preferential treatment, and that's how it should be. We have to grant one another the best treatment in trade and investment. So the regional economic communities will continue to exist. What we are doing is to bring the overarching, this overarching coherence that has not been there for the last 65 years, as I said. It is totally unacceptable that when it comes to trade in Africa, we treat others better than we treat African goods or services or exports. So that is going to stop with this new agreement.
So in a way, the AfCFTA will act like a magnet to help facilitate trade across regions.
Absolutely. We lay the basis. the magnet for cross-regional trade to happen. And that's really, really important. If we want to boost intra-Africa trade, we have to get our regions trading amongst themselves. For now, if you look at our trade patterns, each region is trading with Europe. Yeah. Each region trades more with Europe than with another region of the African continent. And so this goes to the point that you made earlier about integrating the market on our continent. And again, this is where Europe was 70 years ago. Each country was trying to do its own thing, and it didn't work. And they decided that the best thing to do is for them to integrate their markets.
And how many countries have so far ratified the agreement?
We have 42 countries that have ratified the agreement, which, as I noted earlier in the week, that is the fastest ratification in the history of the African Union. In less than 3 years, we've seen these countries ratify the agreement. Only one country has not signed. Those countries that have not yet ratified have not said we are not interested. Okay. They have said we have to go through our domestic legal processes for ratifying international instruments. So I'm very, very positive that by the end of the year, we will start to see the results that we want to see.
I mean, what has been some of the challenges? Because one can only assume that it must be very difficult when you look at some countries, especially looking at their GDPs, as opposed to other countries which are more industrialized.
The first big challenge was, of course, this project started in the middle of a pandemic. So to make the case for open trade in Africa, when 42 countries at that time were either in a full or partial lockdown and borders were closed, it's incredibly difficult to make that the case for an integrated market with open borders in the middle of an unprecedented pandemic. So that was the first challenge. The ongoing challenge is there are countries, the continent has differentials in levels of economic development, as you say. Some countries have a GDP per capita of $110, others much, much higher than that. So countries whose economies are relatively small have reason to be concerned that they will not be taken over or swamped by the big economies of the continent. And so we had to build into the agreement safeguards that will prevent that, number one. And number two, we've had to create what we call special and differential treatment for those countries. So for example, if we want to reduce tariffs, we say that tariffs must be reduced in 10 years. Countries whose economies are smaller will get 15 years instead of 10 years. So we've found legal safeguards, and we've also found practical tools for giving those countries the flexibility that they require in order to adjust to implementation of the AfCFTA.
Looking at the policy, I realized that the free movement of people was omitted.
Yes.
And I want to know why, because one would assume it will go hand in hand.
Absolutely. I agree entirely with you that free movement of persons is one of the drivers of trade. Yeah. However, the reality is that there are very strong sensitivities. Many countries continue to see movement of persons from an immigration point of view. It is going to take time before we transition away from that, which I think we should very, very quickly. We've seen from the experience, there are a handful of countries in Africa that have introduced visa on arrival, for example. They have not been swamped by people, from other parts of the African continent. Nigeria has visa on arrival. Rwanda has visa on arrival. Kenya has visa on arrival. There are other countries. We have also a protocol in the African Union, the Protocol on Movement of Natural Persons. It's been ratified by only 9 or 10 countries out of 55. So you can see that countries are very, very cautious. But I believe that when we have free movement of persons in Africa, just like we have in the European Union, that is when we will have a really, really strong driver and a strong booster of trade in Africa. Starting, by the way, with my own country, South Africa. Yeah. I think South Africa should consider a far more relaxed immigration regime that is tied to trade to enable economic activity to happen. I know there are other countries who also, just like South Africa, who do not have free movement of persons in their immigration law, or certainly who do not yet allow visa on arrival. So I'm a very, very strong supporter of free movement of persons. We've seen the benefits, as I said, here in Europe, of free movement of persons. The security questions will always be there. They will not go away. The terrorist questions will always be there. They will not go away. So I think we need to find innovative mechanisms for dealing with these legitimate security questions, legitimate questions about terrorists that may cross borders and take advantage of that. But I don't think that should really prohibit us from moving forward with free movement of persons.
So this is something that you think, I mean, look, we had it here with Brexit, and it was a major factor. Yeah. And there seems to be a perception that, you know, foreigners coming to your country are just coming to take over your jobs, your work. And we've seen that in some parts of the continent. Nothing is an issue that really needs to be addressed. Let's move on a bit, because in a sense, this is all about globalization.
Yes.
And there's been a debate about globalization, how it favors the super strong economies, and it has a knock-on effect on less industrialized economies. And so I want to get your take on it, because especially here in Britain, the likes of Margaret Thatcher was really condemned for, you know, as I say, neoliberalism policies, you know, liberalization, privatization, and these are forces that drives, you know, the economy. So I want to know your take. How would you go about, or should I say, the African Union mitigating these risks?
Yeah, well, you know, the point you are raising goes to the heart of this debate that has been going on for the last 25 years or so about the benefits of globalization, and or lack thereof. And I do not believe that the African continent is outside of that debate. I think that we are equally affected by the forces of globalization. And second, I think that if a trade agreement is actually an instrument of globalization, and so we have to reflect, and we've been doing that. We have to reflect on how we can avoid exactly that uneven distribution of benefits. Earlier we were talking about the differences in levels of economic development in Africa. And so if we bring in an instrument of globalization that will entrench those differentials, we're not going to succeed. We won't create jobs. We will create a trade agreement that benefits only the big countries, or create a trade agreement that creates jobs only for people in big countries. And we have to avoid that. That is why we have introduced a very, very specific, targeted programs for small, medium enterprises, for example, across countries, so that whether you are a small, medium enterprise in a big country in Africa or a small country, but you have access to finance, you have the advisory tools that you need to expand your market to other parts of the continent, and that you are able to also equally take advantage of this trade agreement just like a big corporation, like MTN or Zenith Bank. I think that's really the key. If we can create opportunities that will make sure that we have even benefits are even across the board, in country and across country. That's, in my view, that's really how we deal with this issue of inclusivity and lack of benefits. And there are practical things that can be done to get us to that point. And we have introduced those programs for small, medium enterprises. We will have a protocol for women and youth in trade who are often left behind by trade agreements. So there are practical steps that can be taken to avoid that backlash that you mentioned.
I mean, you've just touched on women, youth in trade, and seeing as the continent is a youthful population, it's interesting to see how the youth can be added to, you know, the space in which this policy is fulfilled.
We advised the African Union Assembly of Heads of States that by the year 2050, the youngest population in the world is projected to be in Africa, below the age of 25. Already, the population of Africa is a relatively young population compared to other parts of the world. And so if we exclude young people from such an important instrument, we would be doing so at our own peril as a continent. Today, we have young people in Kigali, in Rwanda, in Lagos, in Nigeria, who are at the cutting edge of technological advancements, innovation, digital platforms, e-commerce, and they are doing this without any support. They are doing this without any support, in the absence of any legal framework that is intended to ensure support for them. So the heads of states, and I have to say credit to them, we did not have to convince them. They said, yes, we do need to take affirmative action for young people and for women entrepreneurs who previously have not seen benefits of trade agreements, and yet they are the drivers of Africa's economy. So I'm very, very happy that we have started negotiating the instrument. We're looking at practical provisions that can be introduced in the instrument to make sure that young people and women-led small, medium enterprises, to make sure that they are part of this. It's absolutely critical for inclusivity, and it is absolutely critical for the future of our continent.
And with regards to SMEs, I mean, I did a bit of research, and looked at Nigeria in particular. So in the 70s, you know, textiles in Nigeria was booming, until Nigeria opened its markets, and then it was flooded with second-hand goods from China and India. How would the AfCFTA make sure this doesn't happen with its members?
Well, we mentioned earlier what is outstanding in phase one. It's in the area of rules of origin. Yeah. And they are very critical to a country's industrialization, as you mentioned. So we have to negotiate rules of origin that will foster industrialization in Africa, so that we don't bring in products from other parts of the world and we say they are made in the AfCFTA, causing a distortion in the domestic market and people losing their jobs. So the regime of rules of origin that we've negotiated it requires a high percentage of value addition. So a country has to demonstrate that this has been created in the AfCFTA, that it has not been created in another country. That's how you industrialize. That's how China industrialized. That's how the EU industrialized. So we have to follow this path of industrialization, and rules of origin are key to a region or a country's industrialization. We are working with customs authorities to make sure that they understand the rules of origin that should be applied in accordance with the agreement, so that we can minimize these goods coming in from other parts of the world as if they are AfCFTA traded goods. We will never be able to eliminate transshipment, just like we can't eliminate criminal activity. It will always be there, but we have to make it very, very difficult for that for transshipment of goods to happen.
And finally, this is my final question on e-commerce. Yeah. The pandemic really exposed the continent's over-reliance on, I should say, foreign entities. Yeah. So in terms of e-commerce, why hasn't this been addressed?
It is actually being addressed. In fact, we used to say that we will have a protocol on e-commerce business in Africa. We've now realized that actually e-commerce is a very narrow category. What we want to capture is digital trade. Right. So that there we include electronic commerce, we include movement of data, we include data protection, we include payments, digital payments. We had the first session where we invited African thinkers in digital trade, as well as African SMEs and corporations, to say to them, we know that there's digital trade and e-commerce happening in Africa, and it's happening on its own. What is it that governments can do to provide a legal framework for that to happen? And the legal framework will encourage investment in infrastructure. We had a conversation with one of the big tech companies that said to us, if you have a regulatory framework, we will come in and invest in the infrastructure for digitization or digital trade. So the starting point is to establish the legal framework. So I'm very happy that we have seen, and no one disagrees on the importance of digital trade as a tool for development.
I know I said final question, but I must ask you this question. Mm-hmm. This is about the diaspora. Yeah. The role of the diasporas in the AfCFTA.
The diaspora has a very, very clear role. In fact, yesterday afternoon, we met with some members of the diaspora. If we want to talk about mobilizing investment in Africa, we have now established what we call the AfCFTA Adjustment Fund, which will be intended for countries who will suffer revenue losses as they implement the agreement. And so this fund is intended to offset some of those losses. We had a very good conversation yesterday about how the diaspora can work with us to mobilize capital from around the world to ensure that this AfCFTA succeeds. That's the value of the diaspora. Also, of course, it's not immediately related to us, but there's also an issue of skills transfer and technology transfer that the diaspora has access to in the rest of the world. So certainly there is a role for the diaspora to play, and I must say that everywhere I go, whether it is in the UK or the US, the diaspora is very, very interested to make a contribution. So we will expect the diaspora to come back with capital. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for taking time out to talk to us.
Thank you very much.